Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Nikkor Z 35mm F1.2S. Now, obviously, this is part of Nikkor's highest-end series of prime lenses with the largest of maximum apertures available in autofocusing lenses. These are all extreme instruments. They're big, they're heavy, and they're expensive. In fact, the lens we're reviewing today, which I'm filming on at the moment, is a $2,800 US 35mm prime. That means it's not going to be for everybody. But that f1.2 aperture is really a huge part of what makes this lens special, particularly with a 35mm lens. I think with longer focal lengths, 85mm for example, you can often get away with a smaller maximum aperture because depth of field is still really tiny. When you get to a wider angle lens like 35mm, however, that maximum aperture really allows you some creative options that lenses with smaller maximum apertures just don't afford. So could a 35mm lens that costs $2,800 ever be worth it? Well, the answer is a little bit complicated. So that's what we're going to try to explore in today's review, right after a word from our sponsor, Skillshare. Today's episode is brought to you by Skillshare. Many of you tune into this channel to learn from me, but I find that I'm constantly having to learn myself. Our world and our industry is changing very quickly, and I've personally turned to Skillshare to learn about how to use AI rather than to get abused by it. I've taken some Lightroom and Photoshop editing classes, and even a class on how to get more out of my iPhone 15 Pro through composition and using the right settings. All of that came in handy on a recent trip to Japan. YouTube is great, but Skillshare takes it to the next level, allowing you to get class materials, submit projects, enter in discussion with other members, and even earn certificates. There are thousands of classes on Skillshare that cover a huge range of topics, so you can start learning today. Not only does Skillshare offer a free 7-day trial and 30-day money-back guarantee, but the first 500 people to use my link in the description down below will get 20% off their first year subscription to Skillshare. So get started today and start learning. So before we jump into today's review, I do want to give you a quick disclosure. This lens was loaned to me by Nikon Canada. However, they have had no input on this review, nor have they seen it before you're seeing it right now. As always, this is a completely independent review. So let's talk build and handling. It's pretty clear from the marketing material that I see on Nikon's website that they envision this as being a lens particularly for wedding and then portrait photographers, which makes sense. I think it would be hard to argue the necessity of a lens this extreme for most people in other kinds of industries. And so I did try to look at it from that perspective. Unfortunately, I can't just summon up weddings on demand, but I did try to recreate some of those style shots as a part of my review to see how the lens would handle those detail type shots. Now, clearly this is a massive lens, as is quite obvious. And if you look at the comparison to the 35mm f1.8S that I recently reviewed, you can see just how incredibly big this lens is by comparison. It is 90mm in diameter or 3.5 inches and a whopping 150mm or 5.9 inches in overall length. That's huge. It weighs in at 1,060 grams or 2.3 pounds. And you can see, even though the Viltrox Lab 35mm f1.2, which by the way, this is a comparison to the E-mount version. There is no Z-mount version yet, though it is supposedly coming. But you can see that it towers over the E-mount version of the Lab, an extra 28mm in length and an additional 150 grams in overall weight. So the Lab was a big lens, but this of course is next level big overall. I definitely felt that weight when I was out hiking. I had it on a Peak Design Slide Light strap, which is kind of my go-to strap. And after even a half hour, which is not all that long, I could definitely feel it in my traps. It was kind of aching through there, and I had to swap sides multiple times because there's just a lot of weight. That on my Z8 is a pretty heavy combination. And so you're looking at a couple of kilos there. And so you definitely feel that pulling down on your trap. So this is maybe not your best backpacking type lens. Up front we have 82mm front filter threads, which is shared across all of the f1.2 S-line lenses along with the Plena 135mm f1.8 as well. Now, this is a nicely made lens. It's got a nice degree of build quality. It is a mix of metals and engineered plastics, which is pretty standard fare. However, we do have 11 different seal points according to this diagram, so a thorough professional grade of weather sealing there. And we also have a number of features here, though I will have to say, compared to what I'm seeing on some other brands, the feature set here is a little bit light for a lens that's expensive. It starts with a unfortunately positioned AF-MF switch, and I say unfortunately positioned, I mean it's a pretty common place for this to be on Nikon lenses, but unfortunately on a body like my Z8, this is kind of hidden in here where it is flanked by both the lens release button and then also the port up here for a flash sync cable. And so I find that just reaching around there, I'm having to navigate between two different things to try to get at that. So doing it by field, it is not a great position ergonomically. Frankly, I think it would be better served being up here on the tier with the two function buttons. And so there are redundant function buttons, one on the left side, one on the top. And so you have one near to hand whether you're shooting in a horizontal or a vertical position. Outside of that, what we have as far as features is the customizable control ring. This is not my favorite application of the customizable control ring. I find that this one in particular is really sensitive. And so there's a couple of things that I have used the customizable control ring for personally. I've used it as an aperture ring. I didn't like that because it just went way too fast. So you would jump from f1.2 and you'd be at f8 before you knew it. Just not enough distance on there. So I tried it for exposure compensation. Same kind of thing. It's like I was at -4, I was at +4 EV. And so you had to really be intentional about slowing it down. And by the time you did all of that, it would be faster to do it through some other means. And so I didn't love it for that. Fortunately, in video mode, if I switched it to, power aperture, I was able to do aperture racks nice and cleanly there. So that frankly was the best application that I saw for this customizable control ring. I know it's clickless is the process. In this case, I actually probably would have preferred clicks for the simple reason that it would give you a little bit more precision in your control of it. And so again, for such an expensive lens, that was a misstep in my opinion. Inside we have 11 rounded aperture blades. It does a nice job of keeping a circular aperture shape. As you can see here, we'll go through the rack again and so you can see how that those bokeh circles stayed nice and round there. Now on some of these lenses, they have had an OLED screen on the top, similar to what Viltrox is doing with the Lab series, and it is not present here. And so again, with that customizable control ring, you do lack any kind of direct feedback there because there is no clicks, there's no markings. Frankly, I would prefer just a traditional aperture ring, but that isn't Nikon's approach to these things. And so, it's no use wishing for it. But I do miss the OLED because it just would give you a little bit more feedback. Fortunately, some bodies have the top mounted LCD, but it means that you're looking at the camera rather than at the lens. And so it's not necessarily great in that application. Now, what is great is the big manual focus ring here. It is beautiful, it's nice and white, and it is perfectly damped. So it gives you a really, really great manual focus simulation. And so I felt like I could focus with great precision, and so I did love that. I don't know how often people use these things, but I do find on Nikon with its full-time manual override, these rings can be really useful, and I certainly found that to be the case here. Now, there is no lens-based VR, vibration reduction, so you're going to have to rely on stabilization to come from your camera if your camera is so equipped. If your camera is not so equipped, you're out of luck. And obviously, if you're using Nikon smaller cameras that don't have VR in the camera itself, this lens is probably overwhelming it anyway in terms of the size and weight. Minimum focus distance is 30 centimeters, but interestingly, although the 35mm F1.8S can focus closer, 25 centimeters, it actually has a lower degree of magnification from this lens, which speaks of some maybe focus breathing up close that this lens is able to control because there's lots more room in that lens for these elements to move around. And so it has a 0.20 times level of magnification, which is, a good rating for the class, up in a very useful level. And again, it's going to be nice for those detail type shots of rings, flowers, shoes, all the different things that'll be a part of wedding or portrait photography. And also because of the wider focal length, allow you to get some extra stuff in the frame, even when we're shooting up close. It can be really useful and create very unique type shots. Price here is $2,800. As previously mentioned, that's US dollars. Here in Canada, it is 3,800 Canadian dollars. That's a lot of money. So obviously, this lens is not going to be for everyone because everyone can't afford it. So how about autofocus? Nikon has employed dual STM focus motors here, and I have to say I'm still having to adjust to the idea of high-end lenses like this receiving STM focus motors. Now, to be fair, Nikon's STM focus motors are pretty good, but when I see a lens that will soon arrive on Nikon, like the Viltrox Lab 35mm F1.2 having quad hyper VCM focus motors, it makes me wonder how that lens is going to compare when it arrives. Autofocus here is in many ways good. It is quite fast overall, though not as fast as what I saw with the Plena, nor is it going to be quite as fast as a lens like the 35mm F1.8S. As you can see, autofocus moves back and forth quickly, but indoors I definitely noticed a little bit of a lag in between going from point A to point B. Outdoors, that time shortened down a little bit, and so even though this is a lens that sucks in a lot of light, it still seems to prefer having good light for focus speed overall. There is a little bit of sound. It's not completely silent. You'll hear this very light kind of schnick sound as it moves from point A to point B. It's not loud enough to really be much of a factor, however. In terms of focus speed, I found that I had no problem, for example, as Nala was walking towards camera, just nailing shots as she moved along. That's typically a pretty good test because it is this, forward progression all the time, and autofocus had no problem keeping up even at f1.2. At the same time, when I went out and I tried to shoot at the Hive, sometimes on Nikon, with a good lens, I'm able to pick the bees out of the air, focus grabbing them. I didn't have a lot of great success with that. So what I saw was enough to tell me that I think you're going to have great precision if you're shooting things like portraits or weddings, anything that has, a moderate amount of movement. I'm not sure I would choose this lens necessarily for sports, however. I don't think the autofocus is maybe quite fast enough to work in that kind of scenario, though, I'm open to being wrong on that topic. I do feel at this point that it's probably time for Nikon to move maybe to the next level when it comes to the autofocus systems. And certainly I feel like Sony's recent G Master Prime lenses have a little bit more thrust and a little bit more sophistication in the focus system generally. So how about video autofocus? As is typical, it's a little bit of a mixed bag on Nikon, and part of that is because there are two separate processes at work. If you're doing touch to focus, as I do as a part of my focus pull test, you have no control over those settings, and so what you get is kind of the maximum thrust. It moves kind of maximum speed back and forth, but unfortunately it introduces some quirks, things like you'll see some pulses or sometimes a quick rack in the wrong direction, and so it's just not as sophisticated as what I would like to see. Overall, I got a pretty much average performance, jumps back and forth, but not always with complete confidence in doing that. I was happier when I switched to something like my focus pull test, or just where I put my hand in place and then remove it, because I found there I'm allowed to use the settings that I have set up in the camera. And so I've set it up to where it is reasonably reactive, but it is a little bit more cinematic in the way that it moves back and forth. And I feel like the camera does a better job of doing that with more confidence, and that was certainly true in testing this lens as well. So that means that I was happier with something like my hand test, where I allow the camera to go between my hand and my eye, and autofocus there happened with a little bit more precision. Now, as you've probably seen in all these clips, like this one that I'm filming on it, when it comes to static shots or shots when I'm moving steadily towards camera, autofocus has done a really good job of picking me up and staying locked on me. And so for most things, in most situations, I think that autofocus is going to be just fine. However, if you are looking to do those kind of touch to focus pulls or movements, just note that maybe won't be as cinematic as what you might like. On a positive note, focus breathing is not quite non-existent, but it is very, very low here. And you can see this is at f8. As I manually focus in and out on my test chart, you can see there is very, very little of focus changes in terms of the overall size of objects there. And so that certainly is going to be a positive in allowing your footage to look a little bit more cinematic. If you are pulling focus, maybe pulling it manually instead of doing one of those touch to focus pulls. How about the image quality? We have an optical design of 17 elements in 15 groups, including 3 extra low dispersion elements, 3 aspherical elements, and then a unique spherical ED element, which I haven't really often seen before. This is a exotic high-end optical design, and it has to be because this is where this lens can justify its price tag by delivering image results and image quality that lesser lenses simply cannot match. Now, looking at the MTF chart is only so-so. Now remember, this is at f1.2, so for f1.2 lens, that's great. If you're looking at it just, from a standard of maybe an f1.2 or an f1.8 lens, it doesn't look all that mind-blowing, and in fact, the Viltrox Lab does look better across most of the frame except for maybe the last bit of the extreme corners. So we'll see when that lens comes out how it actually performs on Nikon. But at the moment, this is as good as you're going to get when it comes to a 35mm lens on the Nikon Z mount system. Now, when it comes to the other kind of metrics that I evaluate, I'll quickly run through these, and if you want the deep dive in the optical performance, stay tuned at the end of the video for that. When it comes to longitudinal style chromatic aberrations before and after the plane of focus, very, very well controlled. And so the test chart looks good. The SLR that I use to test for that, all of it looks good there. Likewise, lateral chromatic aberrations, very well controlled as well. And so corners look nice and clean. There is a tiny amount of barrel distortion that is very linear. It's so low you probably don't need to correct it, but it is easy to correct. It took only a +3 to correct for that and to get basically perfect geometry everywhere. Vignette's another story. A lens like the Plena, Nikon very specifically designed it to have basically no vignette, which is very rare in my experience on Nikon. And so in this case, that is not at all what I discovered. It had a +77 that I needed to correct for it. So that's about 3 stops vignette in the corner. It's pretty heavy, and it is going to be obvious without correction. Fortunately, as a first-party lens, the in-camera correction profile, along with the correction profiles in post-editing software, all do an excellent job of eliminating that. Now, when it comes to the chart test, I was shooting on the 45 megapixels of the Z8 and showing you at 200% magnification levels. In the center of the frame at f1.2, it looks fantastic from wide open. The mid-frame looks excellent, and the corners look a bit dark, but outside of that, detail really looks fairly good there. Not as good as the center of the mid-frame, but still very, very good, particularly for an f1.2 lens. I found that if I stopped down even to f1.4, the center and mid-frame contrast jumped up even more, and so it looks really, really fantastic. The corners looked a little better, but really I didn't see peak performance show up in the corners till about f2.8. I will say, however, that at f2.8, I'm seeing a corner performance that I rarely see, however. It's really, really good in the corners at f2.8 when stopped down. So as you might imagine, if it looks great at f1.2, by the time you're shooting at landscape apertures from f4, 5.6, f8, it's going to look fantastic from corner to corner. You can put as high a resolution as you have currently available on Nikon, 45 megapixels, and it looks fantastic everywhere. And so all of that is really, really great. About f11, you're going to start to see a bit of softening due to diffraction, and then f16 is the minimum aperture, and so it's a little more pronounced then. But again, this lens is so sharp that, frankly, even at f16, it still looks pretty good overall. That great contrast allows you to get beautiful saturation levels in your colors. And so I found colors to be really rich from the lens, certainly a strength for it. Likewise, also skin tones looked nice. And so all of that is excellent. Now, where this lens, I think, really kind of sets itself apart is not only in the ability to have great detail, but also to have beautifully soft bokeh at the same time. It's a difficult challenge to pull off both, to have high contrast and detail on subject matters, and then to have a very soft out of focus area. But I think that Nikon has been able to do it with this lens. And I was able to get just really soft, great looking bokeh in a wide variety of situations. And maybe you've seen it in some of the shots that I've already shown, the video clips and different sequences that I filmed outdoors. This shot kind of stood out to me because I was able to produce nice looking bokeh from mosquitoes. And so it's not every lens that can give you great mosquito bokeh. And so kudos to Nikon on that. It also works really well for those wedding style shots. And as mentioned earlier, the fact that you can get close to your subject and have a very narrow depth of field, but have a little bit wider framing. So I think it's going to work really well for the kind of shots where you're trying to highlight maybe some of the details of what a bride and groom are accessorizing with, things like that. Really nice. The other thing that I think is really going to make this lens be exceptional for portrait and wedding photographers is that it is amazingly good in backlit situations. Flare resistance is incredibly strong for an f1.2 lens, which frankly, some of these big aperture lenses can be a disaster when the sun or some other bright light source is shining into the lens itself. That's no problem here. In fact, there are 3 different types of coatings that are being employed here, and they're doing a fantastic job. When it comes to shooting the night sky, obviously, again, this is a kind of an overkill lens for shooting astro, but if you want to try it, it has the ability to produce really crisp star points even at f1.2, and obviously to suck in a massive amount of light, allowing you to keep the ISO level down, and also maybe to get a little bit faster shutter speed, and so that you can, not have movement of the stars, because it doesn't take long at 35 millimeters for that to start to show up. That's the good news. The bad news is it does have a lot of vignette, and so that is going to have to be corrected. You can see it really stand out in the shot. And also there is some chroma in the extreme corners. It looks like birds that are flying out of frame rather than crisp star points. Maybe that's going to be a deal breaker for you, maybe it's not. But I wouldn't buy this lens specifically for shooting chroma, but if you're spending that much money on the lens, you might want to multitask with it. The bottom line is that optically, this is one of the best 35 millimeter lenses ever. And it's going to deliver unique, incredibly good results that very few lenses are able to come close to matching. My conclusion is that this is, for a lot of reasons, not a lens for everyone. I would say that this is an exceptional tool for working professionals who earn a living from photography, or those well-heeled amateurs that just like owning the very best. And frankly, that's it. It is the best 35 millimeter lens that you can get on Nikon Z mount, and I suspect for a few reasons, even when the lab lens comes, while it will be a lot cheaper and much easier to make an argument of it being the best bang for buck 35 millimeter f1.2, there will be areas that distinguish this as still being the best 35 millimeter lens available. I love the ability to play with depth of field at 35 millimeters, and so I think that f1.2 aperture is really valuable. But the flip side is it's big, it's heavy, and it's very expensive. So only buy it if you actually need it. And if you don't need it, fortunately, there is a very good 35 millimeter f1.S and even a 35 millimeter f1.4 that isn't as high end in its overall optical rendering, but from what I understand, still does have a very nice rendering. And I'll get to that lens at some point down the road. Now, if you want more information, you can check out my full text review that is linked in the description down below. There are links to an image gallery and some buying links there. And if you want to go deeper into the optical performance, stay tuned with me right now. We're going to jump into that together. So starting off, we'll take a look at vignette and distortion. You can see just the tiniest amount of a barrel distortion here on the right side. I've manually corrected for it. It's very linear, as you can see, so perfectly easy to correct. Vignette's another story. There's a lot of vignette there, particularly in the far corners, quite concentrated. And so it takes a fair bit of vignette correction, a plus 77, to get to this result here, though the correction profiles will also do a fine job of that. Longitudinal style chromatic aberrations are handled pretty well here. You can see just the tiniest hint of magenta fringing before the plane of focus and a little bit of green afterward. But as I move into a real world subject like this, you can see there's just that tiny amount of green fringing there, but it's not enough to impact anything. I don't see it in the specular highlights at all. It's not going to be a problem. This subject right here is very easy to get because of the depth of field and the contrast. It's very easy to get the fringing on it, and you can just see that tiniest hint of green. It's going to be no problem at all. Likewise with lateral style chromatic aberrations, great correction there. So no problem, no evidence of fringing on either side of the black-white transitions. Now here's the chart test that we'll take a look at for sharpness and contrast. I'm shooting here at f1.2 initially and 45 megapixels on a Nikon Z8. This is 200% magnification. You can see the center of the frame looks awesome. Great detail, great contrast, a lot of precision there. Even wide open f1.2. Mid-frame looks awesome. Just really great detail and contrast, great consistency there. Taking a look at this bill, you can see pretty close to equal, just very slightly left contrast in this lower right corner as we transition out of the mid frame down towards the corner. In the corner, you can see it's darkish, but you can also see pretty good detail all across the frame. And if we take a little bit of a ride around, we can see that it looks good on the left side, looks good in the upper left, and up into the upper right. We see consistency around the frame. How's that look for real-world shots? Here at f1.2, you can see great detail here. Obviously, the ability to really throw things out of focus, even with a 35mm lens, and to focus the eye on one particular subject. Here, shooting up close, you can see that we've got very good detail and contrast here, even at f1.2, so a very narrow plane of focus, but looks great there. Likewise, here, what I really like about this shot is, detail and contrast, color saturation is great, but you see on the sharp edges of this leaf, there's none of that bleeding effect. It's a nice crisp delineation, and of course, beautifully soft background, and we'll get to that in a moment. Here is a shot of Nala, and you can see here that even at f1.2, great precision in just delineating all those fine little hairs. It looks really fantastic. So while we just got through making the point that the lens is great at f1.2, even a mild stop down to f1.4 does make a noticeable improvement. You can see here there's a lot more contrast in the image here in the center of the frame at f1.4, and it just means that this text, for example, pops that much more. In the mid frame here, we can see more detail, just more of the textures, and again, superior contrast. So the brighter areas look brighter, which makes the darker areas look darker as well. Now, if we pop down into the corner here, there is a mild contrast improvement. Again, it's mostly in the brightness areas, but we're not seeing like that big leap ahead in the same way. Looking up here in the upper right corner, it's improved, you can see, but it's not great yet. The greatness comes at f2.8, and you can see here even in the corner that it looks fabulous at f2.8. And as I mentioned earlier in the review, in the summary, I see very few lenses that ever reach this level of sharpness and contrast in the corners at any aperture value. So that just means that real-world landscape-style shots are going to be super crisp. And you can see here in all of these reads, just as we pan across the frame, it's just great detail everywhere that you look. It's a great landscape lens. Probably overkill as a landscape lens, but if you have it, use it because it produces amazing-looking results. Due to diffraction at f11, you're going to see sharpness and contrast start to diminish a bit, and then at f16 it gets softer still, though, frankly, this is still at 200% magnification. It still looks pretty good, all things considered, so if you've got it and you want to shoot at f16, go for it. Now, we not only have a nice degree of magnification, we have a fairly flat plane of focus up close, and as you can see, the ability to render fine details really, really well. And so that's going to help a lot in shooting those shiny objects if you're shooting as a wedding photographer, and so that's really fantastic. I love this shot. It's very rare to be able to pull something like this off with just a 35mm lens, to have that object kind of popping out of that completely defocused background, and then to be able to look at 100% and see that beautiful precision of detail that's showing up there. Here's another shot I think is beautiful. Again, with a 35mm lens, you only have so much distance between a daisy like this and the ground. And so to be able to get this blurred out background is really quite rare with a 35mm lens. And then to add on that great detail there makes for a shot that I think looks pretty great for a simple subject. Colors really pop from this lens. It's got a great degree of contrast and thus color saturation. And so you can see not only is the detail great, the color saturation levels are great. Even this simple image that I shoot very regularly because I can repeat it fairly easily, it shows just really great pop, even at f1.2. Great contrast and detail on this vintage bottle. And then, of course, a really nice level of defocus. The shot of Ferrari shows not only great detail in the fur there, but you can just see in a simple scene, but you can see that beautiful fall off to defocus. This is frankly what you're paying the big bucks for here. Another image here that really could degenerate into something that's much busier due to having stuff in the transition zone in multiple areas in the image, and yet you can see that it pulls it off with a plumb. It looks really, really fantastic. I mentioned this shot earlier, and here you can see all of these little mosquito bokeh highlights, which is not something that I'm often praising, but it looks pretty cool here. And this image here shows the nice foreground bokeh, so nice rendering there. Detail on the subject, and again, these shiny subjects are handled with good contrast, no fringing issues, and then you can see just lots of specular highlights. And yeah, you get a little bit of the cat eye shape, but in general, the bokeh highlights are really beautiful from this lens. Coma performance, as mentioned, in the center of the frame looks great. We're not having any kind of marring from fringing. Star points are really crisp. You can keep the ISO low. You can see here we definitely have, some light fall off in the corners, and then as we look here, you definitely see some effects of coma, and the brighter the highlight is, the more obvious it's going to be that it has taken wings and the stars are trying to fly away out of the image. And so not a perfect coma performance, but I would still consider it to be useful. Flare resistance, however, I'm unequivocal about. It is fantastic. Usually shooting right into the sun like this at f1.2 would just be an absolute mess. And you can see it's anything but. As you stop down, contrast is holding up really well. There's no nasty ghosting pattern starting to emerge. And even if we drop the sun right up into the corner, this little tiny dot is about as bad as it gets. Those are great coatings at work there. Overall, this is a pretty fantastic instrument optically, and I particularly love images like this where the sun is right out of frame and you can see just a nice glow to the image. Everything holds up beautifully. So yeah, this lens is a beast, but it's also a beast optically, as you can tell from the breakdown here. So hopefully the deep dive has helped you to decide whether or not you're ready to spend the big bucks to acquire this bad boy. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.